haven't received Louise's book. You have to see that scrapbook. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it.
It's interesting. Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest tonight is the director of the leading museum of modern art in the world, Richard Oldenburg. When the Museum of Modern Art was created, it filled a tremendous void. Today, modern art is considered standard. How has that changed the function of your museum?
It certainly started off with one of the largest questions. A lot of things have changed. Obviously, when this museum was founded in 1929, it was founded, by the way, with a show of Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh. It was obviously a completely different world. There weren't anywhere near the number of galleries. In fact, that's almost absurd. There were almost no galleries in New York showing modern art. There were no museums really giving any attention, which was the reason the museum was founded. During that time, all kinds of changes have taken place. The most unique thing about the museum when it was founded was that it projected itself in the dream of Alfred Barr as being a museum that would not only be concerned with painting and sculpture and drawings and prints, but would also get into the fields then completely new for museums of photography, film, architecture, and design. Can you hear? Problem? Any problem with hearing back there? So that in all of these areas we had all kinds of pioneering roles in the exhibitions that we had and introduced a very large public to it. We've had international shows, circulating shows. We've continued to do all of those things, but there's that marvelous kind of tendency to say, well, that's fine, but what have you done for us lately? And we feel we're doing pretty well on that score. But it is a different world. It's a world where we have to re-examine, it's also a world full of financial problems. It's one we have to re-examine what we can do in terms of financial terms if we can't do everything, and that leads you to the question of what can we do best, and then you get into areas where you don't want to duplicate the work that galleries are doing. You want to do what a museum can do best, things like major retrospectives of important artists where we can collect the works from all kinds of collections from the artists themselves, which we're doing. We're also, because of the strength of our collections, operating more and more as a central national and international resource for other museums, and we're lending each year. In the past 10 years we've been lending more works than we have on display in our own galleries, so that in itself is a kind of revolution for this museum. I could go on and on to say how the world has changed, but it's a very large question, and maybe we'll be getting at all those points.
How does your museum differ from other museums of modern art?
Well, I think I've said one of the major things right off the bat, namely the various concerns. Now, this has been less true only in very recent years. I mean, for very many years, this museum was the only one with photography shows, as I mentioned. Of course, we built up the film library. As all of you are aware, new museums were sprouting up all over the country in the 60s, so that that exclusivity isn't necessarily the thing that it used to be, and the 20s as well. The thing that really sets this museum apart from everyone else is something that sometimes seems boring to people, but it is simply the fact that by having started when it started, with the concerns that it had, it built up what is just without question the greatest collection of modern art in the world. And I'd say that the most important difference or the distinction of this museum is just definitely tied precisely to the strength of the collections, because no one with all the money in the world or with all the resources could build this collection again today. So that goes back to the resource center aspect. Obviously, there are other museums of modern art. There are museums that are doing some things that we've either done in the past or no longer doing. There are some museums doing things that we have done less of, like, the whole art center scene that came up particularly in the 60s with the performing arts and happenings and so on. Some museums are doing more of that than we have, although we've been involved in that field too. But the real distinction has to be just the scope of the collection, the strength of the collection, and our activities. The fact that we're really an international museum is what it comes down to.
What is the genesis and the evolution of the museum? And you might talk about its international connections as well.
Well, the genesis, it was...
Who started the museum? Who were the early directors, the founders, the trustees? Where was it housed?
Well, it's, again, a long story. Try to make it brief. The museum opened its doors in 1929 in a building that still exists over here, the Heckscher Building on Fifth Avenue. And they had 6 rooms, and it was basically an exhibition gallery. One of the things that we like to point to as we get into worse and worse financial problems is that it was founded with a whole group of dedicated people who thought this was a marvelous idea, made all kinds of declarations about the future. And the first show opened on November 7th, 1929, and Black Tuesday, when the crash came, was on October 29th. So it was an inauspicious beginning, but we managed to survive for almost 50 years, and we figure we can survive financial problems now. When the museum was first launched, it obviously didn't have any collection. It was primarily a device by which you could introduce a public in New York to the works that were in many cases really several decades old, but were just unfamiliar to audiences here. The thing that's fascinating when you go back into history of this museum, however, is how absolutely completely Alfred Barr, who of course was the guiding genius of this museum, laid out exactly what the future was going to be. There's a marvelous thing. The first statement of the museum was somewhat edited from what Alfred had written, and it said that we are going to get into, the final statement said that we are going to get into possibly get into other phases of modern art without detailing what they were. What was edited out in Alfred's statement was an exact statement of what he planned to do. Photography, film, architecture, furniture, design, all of these aspects, and he never forgot what that plan was. The other thing that was unusual was that even though it was an exhibition gallery and didn't really think in terms of a collection, or couldn't think at that time in terms of a collection, that opening statement made it very clear that what the people founding the museum, putting together, was going to be a museum. They said that this was too great a city not to have a museum of modern art, that modern art was on view in other major capitals in Europe, that they were going to build a museum. They ultimately looked ahead to archives, to collections, to all of the things that we think of as constituting a museum. Well, it took a long time for that to happen, but when the museum first opened, they were absolutely astonished by the numbers of people who came. I've forgotten what the attendance was in the first year, but just that show, I believe, had something like 47,000 visitors for this work that supposedly nobody cared about or wasn't interested in seeing.
Where did the money come from?
The money came from a number of people who were involved, Mrs. Rockefeller, Miss Bliss, a whole series of people, but it was a very modest amount of money. I can just better than even, I don't even know what the beginning lump sum was, but I do know from reading a chronology of Alfred Barr's that at one point he was terribly grateful, not too many years later, for having gotten $1,000 for which he went off to Europe, and I've forgotten the list, but he brought back 2 clays and one, I've forgotten what it was, but it was about 18 paintings that were really of major importance, and that was a nice small shopping trip that you were able to accomplish in those days. Just to move on more quickly, what the museum then did, it moved successively to a house that belonged to the Rockefellers on this property, basic site, moved again when the museum had started to collect and had gotten things like, the real kernel of the collection was the Lily P. Bliss collection, which was given. She was one of the founders, gave her collection, which had some really great works in it. And then from there on, the collection built up. Through 39, we expanded here. Next big expansion was in 64, and basically that's the building that we're in now with various extensions on it. The collections continue to grow, so we've always had a space problem, and we're facing a terrible space problem now. And that's one of the reasons we've been talking about, as I imagine we'll get into later, some building expansion. But to capsulate the history of this museum, except in specific terms, is really pretty tough. It's amazing when you go back through history how similar the arguments have been. There was never enough money. People always wondered whether the museum should collect or exhibit or do both, which works they should keep, which ones they should do, what were their duties to the artists. It's very surprising. You can get the same kind of arguments that people are having now as though they were new questions for this museum. We were having in 32, 42, all of these years. They don't change that much.
How should a stranger coming to this museum for the first time best organize his time? What's the best way to see this museum if one had an afternoon?
Well, there are a lot of ways to see this museum. I think that you've always got the competition of the fact that normally the museum has at least one major exhibition, then has smaller exhibitions which people tend to forget about, and not only on the first floor but in our departmental galleries. And some of the most distinctive and really interesting shows are the ones that we have up in for example, the Architecture and Design Gallery or in the Photography Gallery. I'm sure that many of you know this perfectly well, but a lot of people who are making their first visit don't. Obviously, what I would have to say, leading out of what I'd said earlier, is that if I were telling anyone what to do when he or she first came to this museum, if indeed it was the first time, I think I would immediately suggest that they go to the second floor where the permanent collection begins in terms of the earliest works, Cézanne, beginning mostly with the works in the 1880s, go through the second floor, through the third floor, up through the abstract expressionists, and then look at the contemporary works that are downstairs and on the first floor gallery. I might add the somewhat peculiar arrangement owes a great deal simply to the fact that the ceiling heights vary, and so some of the pictures that might more logically be one place can't be placed on that floor. But after all, the collection is the most important thing. But then you'd be worried about what they had missed. They wouldn't have seen the other collections. They wouldn't have seen the other aspects of this museum. I would hope they'd take some time to walk out into the garden, even if it's cold. I can't think of anything that's more marvelous about this museum than that garden. By that time, they're very tired, and I hope they sit down and spend some money in my restaurant. I never know what to do when I tell people how to go to a museum, because I know I do it myself. No matter how much you love art, there's a certain attention span where you really feel that your initial reactions are true ones or correct ones, and I always like to, even to a great museum, unless I know I'm never going to see it again, I like to make one visit and then make repetitive visits. I think that to try to take anything all in at once is impossible.
In the 1920s, when there were waves of American tourists going to Europe and some Europeans coming to live in America, there were a series of articles written about the 3-second span, and that was considered the usual attention span of an American zipping its way through through a European museum.
Well, some of those distances are pretty long in the Louvre if you're running from the Winged Victory to Mona Lisa and so on. But even the answer I've given is, not to be touting the place unduly, but obviously even if you saw everything that was on display in this museum, and that is part of the space problem, you're not seeing what are in the study centers that each department has, where the works are available for people who make special appointments. We have people there for scholars who want to see these paintings, and these are the works that we will loan to other institutions and replace. And these are all there. At any given time in this museum, we are only showing normally, even in the painting and sculpture area, about 15% of our collection.
How vast is the collection?
Oh dear. In terms of number of works,
painting, sculpture, design.
I really couldn't even give you a figure on the number of objects. Obviously, when you get into, I would say that painting and sculpture in terms of objects is probably in the area of about 3,000. But then you have the prints area where there are many times that. It really becomes a statistical thing. But, I mean, one wouldn't expect that everything in a collection would be shown. We show, alas, far less of it than we would like to show. When I say the 15%, as our chief curator has said many times, it's one hell of a 15%, so it isn't quite as depressing as it sounds, but it's depressing to people who would really like to be able to make the whole collection visible.
I would assume it's even more depressing to young artists. How do they get a chance to be shown in this pantheon?
Well, you might be asking the question two ways. If we're talking about showing in the collection terms, this was a difficult decision we made because of our space problems. We used to have we used to have two major exhibition galleries on the first floor that we devoted to temporary exhibitions. As we got more and more crowded, we realized that we simply, much as we wanted to have these exhibitions, felt they were important to have, we could not be in the position of not showing our most contemporary work on a constant basis. So that with great difficulty and anguish, we then took what we used to call the East Wing Gallery, which is, those of you who know the museum, is the first big gallery to the right off the lobby. And we gave that over with very few exceptions. Occasionally we've had shows because of conflicts and so forth. We gave that over to showing most recent works from our collection, and as the case is now, primarily new acquisitions, works that we've bought in the last year and a half. So that's one way to answer your question. In other ways, of course, we do have the exhibitions in which the artists are included in temporary shows. Some of you may also be familiar with this series that we have in the small first floor gallery called Projects, which is specifically designed to show without tremendous fanfare, without great hullabaloo, but to show properly a whole series of individual young artists who might be lesser known or who might not be shown in that aspect of their work at galleries. And in the last 4 years, I think we've shown over 30 artists in that gallery. So that's a continuing program.
How do you distinguish between that which is new and good and that which is new and worthy of your museum?
Between that's new and good and new and worthy. Well, we're talking about new now. I mean, in some cases, whether it's new or old, there's, if you're talking about worthy of our museum, one consideration, assuming quality in both parts of your question, one consideration for any museum, no matter how hard it tries, is that it will have lacunae in its collection. And frequently, you will be more interested in acquiring a particular work by an artist who isn't represented than acquiring yet another work by an artist who is. Or you might have a less typical work by that artist. So sometimes the consideration between two works that our curators would think would be equal quality, they would choose one that gave a better picture of that artist's work. Because one thing, speaking strictly from the collection point of view, one thing that is, I guess, another aspect of uniqueness that comes out of the collection is that this is to use a pompous word, it's a synoptic collection. It is very much dedicated to the idea that by really going through the permanent collection, you are really seeing a survey of the developments in modern art as well as our space permits. And for example, we were very happy, to take hardly a recent example, but we were very happy last year to acquire an important Munch painting, because the museum did not have that, although it had some fine drawings and some prints. That was an important gap in our collection. That was more important to us than a Picasso or something in which we are much richer, because that was a gap that we felt. As far as the new works go, if we're really talking about the determinations of acquiring things, one of the glummer considerations is the fact that, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing from all the other museums, that we have fantastically limited acquisitions funds. Nobody really realizes that a museum as great as this one is operating not only with financial problems all over the place in terms of inadequate endowment and so on, but also we have, on the level of acquisitions for painting and sculpture, we can really count on in any year, aside from special gifts that we can acquire in that year, something on the order of the unbelievable figure of between $12,000 and $20,000, which is really from consistent giving. Now, I don't need to tell any of you how far that goes in a market where not only reputations are very high, but artists have the ludicrous idea that they should be able to live off of their work, and it's quite a different world. So our acquisitions are terribly limited. We are dependent, even in the contemporary field, to the expectation that people will help us, that we will get gifts, that and we really depend a great deal on the kindness of friends in this museum, so that many times there'll be a work that we wish we could acquire that we simply can't afford to, or even pick out of a gallery. We'll work very hard then to put together a way in which we get that. But what you see in this museum is not necessarily what this museum in the contemporary field would ideally like to have, and I might say there are some works here that I think most of the curators would admit that we might even ideally not like to have at this point.
We'll have to ask you what both categories are specifically.
Well, I mean, I'm only making the point that Alfred Barr made over and over again over the years, because part of the price of having been a museum that was established as early as this and became as famous as this museum was that people assumed that it became a kind of absolutely perfect selector, that it was really telling everyone what was good and what was bad.
Well, to what degree does the new museum operate as an arbiter in ascertaining what is art and what isn't?
It's a role that you don't necessarily want, that the museum gets. I mean, a museum as famous as this one obviously acquires that role. That doesn't mean that it's an improper one, because you like to think that you have the best curators you have, that they devote their best energies to locating works, to identifying movements that are important. But the point I was making that led into this was that Alfred was it was terribly important to Alfred to emphasize to people that as he was collecting these works, that he considered them to be works that should be added to come into the collection, that they would have to stand the test of time. And he once said with great modesty that he would be happy and relieved if 1/10 of the works he was acquiring in that time withstood the test of time. And he believed that collections should be refined, that judgments are never perfect. You have all the judgments of artists themselves. I can tell you any number of artists artists who absolutely loathe the work of another artist and will tell you why it's terrible and it's outraged and the museum should acquire it, and the vice versa, so that no one is in total agreement. The museum, someone, however, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the arbiter role because someone at least has to have the courage to take that role. And with all the human failings and professional failings that you have, I think a public or the artist look quite properly to a museum to do that, to stay a step behind, to assess the field, to pick out what in its best judgment is the work that holds most promise, that has the most interest. Sometimes they'll be mistaken, sometimes they've proved to have been dead right.
We're going to pause for one moment for technology. Every 20 minutes, the cassette has to be changed. But I'd like to extend that point when we... Just terrific. He really is.
Of course, if he wants to have artists that build things that big, he's...
Well, he permits them access to it. We were talking about collecting. Museums still have a historical obligation to collect in exemplary fashion and without funds. How can you do it? Tom Messer has recently said there are 3 ways to do it, and they're begging, borrowing, or trading. To me, trading is a rather polite way for a rather nasty new, it's not a new word, but new to a larger vocabulary, and that is deaccessioning. How do you do it?
Well, again, let me answer the question in a number of ways. In other words, if that's what Tom said, Tom is quite right. Those are the avenues. And when you talk about deaccessioning, I mean, I can explain what our procedures are, but...
I hope you will tell us the museum's policy towards deaccession.
The thing is that it's something that I think a lot of people misunderstood when there was the controversy about the Metropolitan, was that a lot of people in fast reading, people who were not involved in the art world, and fast reading of all those articles, got the impression that there was something wrong in deaccessioning per se. Pardon?
Or new.
Or new, exactly. The truth of the matter is that museums in this country, and for that matter, other than the big public museums in Europe, it's primarily in this country as private museums, many of the greatest collections in this country, and certainly this one, have been built up in precisely that fashion because there were simply not the funds to acquire the works. And it's been a progressive refining and development of the collection. What you see here, almost every one of the great works that you see here has frequently, I shouldn't say that, but a great many of them have been acquired only because what was, I think, in retrospect, correctly then felt to be lesser works were in effect traded to acquire those works. There's nothing wrong with it, with the procedure. In fact, we wouldn't have the collections we have if it weren't for that. What you have to do, aside from the very obvious fact that you respect a donor's wishes, and it just goes without saying, you have to be very careful in doing it to protect yourself against obvious dangers. To mention one, the clearest danger is changes of taste and fashion. If you don't have proper controls on this, an artist who is not fashionable at a certain period will be blithely traded by a curator who is being with it at that time, and you can create disaster simply by changes of taste. This museum, and I think it's true that many other museums, have also been very careful to try to control this, both institutionally and in terms of an approach. It is far more difficult for this museum to decide to deaccession an artist who is, quote, out of favor than it is to deaccession something that is more obvious. Normally our curators will not propose it because they will feel that that is a kind of difference in time and study.
What happens to the reputation of a living artist?
Well, this was, let me finish.
Sorry.
The other very important proscription that this museum set for itself is that we never sell the work of a living American artist, for the obvious reason that even if the reason for trading that work might be valid, it could be taken by some people as a judgment on the quality of that artist's work, or for that matter, simply being in competition with that artist in his own market. So this is something we do not do. In a few instances, where we have wanted to acquire what we felt was a better work, we have gotten the artist's permission himself to trade, in effect, his work for that work, and that has been done in a few instances. Other than that, we simply don't do it with living American artists. Our own procedures here, without going into too much detail, just to give you some idea of the kind of controls that we have, it is, of course, when the first question comes up of doing it, it is thoroughly discussed in the curatorial department that's responsible, and a full staff discussion with all the pros and cons, bringing in any other advice if they wish. Only at that point does it then go to in the case of painting and sculpture, Committee of Painting and Sculpture, and each of the other curatorial departments has a comparable committee. That is a committee that is not only composed of trustees, although our trustees are very knowledgeable, it's also composed of acknowledged experts in the art field. And taking painting and sculpture as an example, the chairman of that committee is George Hurd Hamilton. Other members are Robert Rosenblum, Emily Rao, a lot of people who are acting really as advisors to prevent any mistakes from happening. Only when that committee has recommended that a work be deaccessioned will it go then to the full Board of Trustees, where it is again presented as something for their consideration. And if there is any real controversy over the work, chances are it will not go through. In other words, with all of those stages, there's still the possibility at that level that if people feel strongly that this is a mistake, that it would in effect go back through the process of reconsideration. We have tried to build in all of the proper safeguards we can. At the same time, we have to recognize that in a time when really large acquisitions funds simply aren't available, this is the only way in which the collection can be refined. And the ultimate test of how well it's being done has to be a balance against the works that have been deaccessioned versus the works you have acquired, and I think I would happily have this museum's record stand on that.
Who are your trustees, and how do they become trustees?
Well, there are 40 of them. You search for all kinds of different qualities in trustees.
What's the formula of this museum?
Well, Philip Johnson was once quoted as saying that there were 3 qualifications: money, money, money. It isn't really that crass. You have trustees on your board who are there because of expertise in the arts or professionalism. You have trustees who will give you the kind of the work that you need on your committees, on planning, financial help, even if they aren't giving themselves. You have trustees who are extremely generous to the museum, but they also have to be generous. They aren't generous. We've learned in a very clear way. They are not generous and will not be expected to be generous unless they have a serious interest in the arts, which is why they get involved with this museum or with any other museum. I think a lot of institutions make a mistake in acquiring a trustee simply because he or she has money or has a good record of being intelligent on policy issues or any of these considerations. If you don't have that basic interest, the trustee will tend not to be of any use to the institution. We've been very lucky. Our institution is a young one, after all, comparatively young among museums. 50 years will be 50 in 1979, so we're just approaching that date. We have on our board a number of people who've been involved with this museum for 20, 30, 40 years.
Is the junior council a feeder system for the board as well? In fact, I've often been uncomfortable with that reference, junior council, considering the fact that some of my most distinguished peers in town are junior council members. What does that mean? And have you ever thought of changing the name?
Well, we have thought of changing the name, and certainly the members of the junior council have thought of changing the name. We've never really been able to come up with a better one.
Are there only women on the junior council?
No, there are men and women.
And what's their function?
The function is really to, as with auxiliary groups in other museums, but they're a particularly active one because one of the things that they help us do is to do a number of community programs, student evenings. In other words, they actively help us with the program of the museum. They've also traditionally been very much involved in our publications area with, for example, Christmas cards, objects, so on in the stores. It's been a very active group, continues to be, and to answer your question, yes, it's frequently in the past. There are many of our trustees, our president was a former head of the junior council, Mrs. Parkinson, any number of them have been involved with that, so it has so many of them that it has proved to be that. It's another way of saying whether it's a feeder group or not. What happens is that when you have people, younger people who are really interested in an institution like this, they tend to want to find an outlet, a means by which they can get involved. And the Junior Council has been very good, just as the International Council is another device.
Can you tell us about the
If you can think of a better name for the Junior Council, I'll be very happy.
Well, perhaps
we've had some funnies, but I won't repeat them.
Some members of the class.
Yeah.
Maybe you should make some suggestions so that we know what to reject.
I can only remember the funny ones. I don't think
Well, tell us.
I think I'd better.
Oh, no. You made reference to the publications influence. It was an area, obviously, of your greatest influence because, as I recall, less than 7 years ago, there you were in publishing, and now you find yourself the director of the major museum of modern art in the world. How did that evolution take place?
Well, by chance is all I can say.
And the museum's necessity.
No, I came here to the museum, I was in the publishing world myself. I was managing editor of Macmillan at the time. And then I came here as director of publications at the museum. And this museum has had what it has called, what really is the largest publishing program of any museum in the world.
How many
that
books
isn't
do you
saying all
publish a
that
year?
much, but it's that we are, in terms of books, it can be between 15 and 20, but then there are all the other things considered publications. In other words, in terms of whether objects we produce or everything from cards or small catalogs, a lot of things fall in that category. It still is larger, and I think one of the reasons it was attractive to me to come here from the publishing world was that it had a long tradition of being professionally involved in publishing, and of course anyone who knows this museum knows how admirable and how important the museum's publications have been. In many ways, I think that's the way in which this museum has influenced more people than it ever has through its collections or through its exhibitions.
Well,
Because books obviously can reach all over the world.
Aspect of the museum's program, but it wasn't a very profitable one, from what I gather, until you came. What occurred in your tenure as director of publications in terms of volumes and, to be very direct, profits?
Well, I think you're giving me some credit I don't deserve, because the museum was caught in the publications department was caught in that standard vice that everyone is, that we have the publications as membership benefits. We had large inventories that had built up over the years. We had the most important thing, the obligation as a museum not to think primarily of the commercial rationale for this book. I mean, with most of the books we were publishing had a limited audience. That was why we were publishing them. The trouble is that as costs rose, you found that more and more difficult to cover. So that what I faced was a situation that my predecessors had been facing. It had just gotten worse, and we tried to compensate so that we could publish a few books that were more popular, so that we could afford the books that were not necessarily popular. We certainly succeeded in doing that in some cases, but many of my predecessors had done the same. And I think you all know the Family of Man book, which grew out of the exhibition here, which has gone on selling in the tens of thousands over the years. I had no responsibility for that. That's the kind of a book that if one does publish, it makes it possible to support other publications.
How instrumental was that show in a sense, validating photography as an art form to a larger public?
Oh, that's really a point I think that the head of our photography department could answer better, John Zarkowski. I think that it certainly made an enormous audience aware that photography was something that could speak to them as effectively as paintings could or as other works could. Certainly it developed a great popular audience for photography. How much the works represented in that show really I mean, there were so many of the greatest artists of our time, photographers represented there, but the show itself was, after all, a theme show. It didn't necessarily show other aspects of their work, so I think it was mainly a case of acquainting a larger audience with the potential that was there.
And a very significant one. I think it was one of the times that photography was not thought of as merely a chemical, duplicatable process, but something worthy of being housed in a museum. How significant is the photography department here?
Very significant. I don't know how to answer that. We have
I mean, in terms of your overall program, the amount of time and space.
Well, maybe it's a help to explain something.
And what are the changes since Mr. Steichen started that center and the current interest in photography?
Well, the growth in interest, of course, has been phenomenal. The department has always been one of the most important departments here. I mean, I really think that the best way to put this in context is that this museum unique in another aspect. It really has a collegiate structure. It's almost like a college. We have 6 curatorial departments: painting, sculpture, photography, architecture and design, film, drawings, prints, and illustrated books.
While you're explaining that hierarchy, perhaps you'll tell us also how and who decides what is shown here.
Okay, I'll try to get all these in sequence. The point I was making with that structure was that the photography department is obviously one curatorial department within that. When we're talking about shows, when we're talking about allocating space in the museum, we are very conscious of the fact that each of these departments should be represented, not only by works from the collection, but also by exhibitions, so that they have the opportunity to really show what they think is of most interest happening in their field. So that we will try, with the kind of competition among those departments for the small space we have to stretch these out over a longer period of time. Photography department, of course, has the photography gallery up here. We also have the circulating exhibitions, which go all over the country, and many of those are also in the photography field, and I think we've done a great deal in that field for just that reason. Obviously, photographs are easier to handle, you can travel them, so that this has tended to be a major program of doing this. As far as selecting the exhibitions, it follows really from what I've said, that you have these 6 departments with an expertise that the director, whoever he is, couldn't presume to have in each of those disciplines, so that you really have their judgments in each of the departments on what they think is most important, what they feel the museum should best be doing at that time. Then you arbitrate those competing demands or competing desires in an endless series of meetings, and both in conversations among the curators themselves from the varying departments and with the director, other considerations of balancing the program. You don't want to have 3 historical shows in a row. You try to make a mix just as you would if you were planning a program schedule for a symphony. And in general, this works very well. We have really not too many conflicts over on philosophical principles.
We now have a new museum of design in New York, what the Smithsonian calls the first National Museum of Design. Over a very extended period of time, this museum has had a very distinguished department of architecture and design. What do you see as the relationship between your architecture and design department and the new Cooper-Hewitt?
Well, I think that remains to be seen, because I think the Cooper-Hewitt is really in the process of sort of defining itself right now. Obviously, there's one major distinction just right off the bat. The Cooper-Hewitt obviously is, among other things, is primarily meant to house the great collection that used to be down at the Cooper Union, the Cooper-Hewitt collection, which is really a design history. It goes far back in time. It's an accumulation of objects, marvelous objects. I love the collection myself. This collection, architecture and design, was not built on the same principles, quite aside from its origin in time, being, of course, much later as a cutoff date. It was also very much directed to industrial design. The bulk of the collection, although we have Tiffany objects and a number of unique objects in the collection, the bulk of the collection, both by intent and by in fact, are objects that our curators over the time have felt were particularly well designed, whether cookware or radio phonographs or brooms or ladders. If any of you have ever seen the design, but not only the Goodwin Gallery, but the study center downstairs, that's the nature of the object. Really, that's been the focus of the collection. It was always an idea that it was helping, among other things, to promote good design. That doesn't mean that it isn't in that area. Now, obviously, we always welcome, anyone in the city likes to see a city get more diverse in facilities. Nothing is wrong with more museums or with more spaces to show work. One worries a little bit in terms of diversion of financial resources, as you have other things like the Cooper-Hewitt or the International Center of Photography and so on. That's a selfish view, but it's one we all have to have because we are competing for the same monies. Other than that, I welcome them. I think that they're, it's a marvelous thing the institution has been there. Obviously, one of the things that was a surprise to a number of people was the show with which the Cooper-Hewitt chose to launch it, simply because it was very much a show that was dealing with contemporary design and design themes rather than opening with the collection. This was a decision that the director made. I wouldn't comment on it here, but of course it suggests that they are planning more than a collection course. If so, I hope that we'll complement each other in a good way.
This museum, of course, has focused on architecture and the built environment for quite some time, and more in general, and now very specifically. And the nature of my question is, why are you building an apartment house on your roof, so to speak?
Well, that's a very simple answer. No, the project that all of you have read about, and I won't take the time to...
Please do describe it briefly.
Well, I'll describe it very briefly, but if anyone wants to ask any questions, but I really don't want to take the time because it is potentially so complex. In essence, the problem of this museum is a dual one. I've already mentioned the severe financial problems we have. We've been running deficits since 1966. Because we're a young institution, we have a very small endowment.
What is the endowment?
The endowment is only on the order of $14 million, and we have a basic operating budget of $7 million, so the endowment just amounts to about 12%. Our real budget, if you count in publications, activities, restaurants, and so on, is on the order of $9 million. So in other words, we have a very big program with which the endowment is not the most significant factor. The most significant factor is admissions, memberships, the things that we can earn for ourselves, the bookstores, and of course the annual fund, which we've gotten up to over $1 million this year. In spite of that, in the last few years, we've been running deficits in excess of $1 million, and this year with tremendous effort, I'm very proud that we've managed to get it down to slightly less than $800,000, but it's difficult to be very pleased with any deficit on that order. So looking out toward the future, as costs rise and salaries adjust to inflation and all of this business, we were faced with a question of how in heaven's name is this museum going to assure its survival? Because you could just take simple mathematics, divide the deficit into the amount of money you've got in the endowment, and you can tell how long the museum could survive. So that was one problem, and a very crucial one. The other one, which I've also mentioned, and that was just as crucial, is the space problem. And that isn't a kind of curatorial hubris. It isn't that everyone wants to expand. It's the simple fact that I mentioned earlier. We have not got the space to show the collection, and it seriously becomes a question of the public responsibility of an institution. We have promised gifts coming to us from great collections, works that are of such quality that they absolutely must be on view to the public. We want to be able to show the full spread of this, of the collection. To take an example, when we showed that show that some of you remember not too long ago, that Picasso in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, just drawn from our own collection, and we could do the same thing with Miro or with Matisse. Only a portion of those works filled the whole garden wing that we were able to have available for temporary exhibitions, and everything has to be a selection.
Excuse me, we're going to pause for one moment.
Okay.
You can regroup while we do that.
Well, I'm sorry, I was saying so much on the introductory thing. I'll explain the basics of the project, but this is really what it's down to.
I would like to get to that in a moment.
Small space that we have here, a space which, by the way, a favorite statistic that we quote is that the entire gallery space of this museum, the entire exhibition and gallery space of this museum would fit in simply the central portion of the Great Hall as you enter the Metropolitan Museum. So you have some idea of what we're dealing with. So that it really creates a safety factor. We've had over 1 million people here in this past fiscal year, and there are some times when you have a popular show where that becomes a very serious consideration.
How far can the audience be expanded?
There are obviously differing times. If we have a very expensive, very popular show here, you will have to set up lines, you'll have to ration the people going into a gallery, and when you go in there, it sometimes isn't a very pleasant experience because you're looking over heads of people and so on. You can't really answer that question. There are other times, if everyone came at 11 o'clock on a rainy day, then we could expand it a great deal.
Let me bring up a less than pleasant thought. The Museum of Modern Art very graciously extended one of its boardrooms to a civic organization, at which time a presentation of the new project was given. A very thoughtful member of that board, not a Philistine, not an irreverent person, proceeded to describe what he considered an alternative to the Museum of Modern Art's program. however rash it sounded at his proposal. There are a number of other thoughtful people who reflected on it. The point that he made was, A, is it appropriate to still call yourself a museum of modern art when obviously so much of your collection has become accepted as the standard art of the past 50 years? So he maintained that perhaps it would be in the public and the museum's interest to do something other than what you had in mind. He was very concerned about what he considered the most beautiful public space in all of New York, the one that you referred to earlier, namely the garden of the Museum of Modern Art, and the potential of casting a shadow on that urban oasis and diminishing some of its, rare beauty. He thought perhaps it might not be a bad idea for the museum, however irreverent this sounds, to sell from some of its collection and get rid of the things which are successful, which are established, widely established, and revert to its original function of being a museum of modern art, since those very widely established pictures no longer need, he felt, a museum of modern art to promote them.
Well, Barbara, you've asked about 14 questions. I don't know which one to deal with. If you want to go back to the deaccessioning thing, I could answer that.
Well, it's really conceptual.
Well, in other words, shall I skip talking about the project? Because
no, please do, but how would you respond to
Well, there isn't going to be a shadow. You don't deaccession the works for money. There's so many answers to the question. I don't know which one to take first. As far as the whole, let me take the last one first. There's a real myth about this.
The real question really is, were there alternatives? Because obviously a lot of very thoughtful and responsible people on your board must have exhausted a great number of possibilities till they came up with the solution that you have.
Well, shall I begin at the beginning or at the end? In other words, at the beginning I'll explain what the project was. The last thing is something that I can't just let go by because
Please.
I was talking to the myths of the museum. You make the assumption, which is one of the myths that some people make, that this was a place that was always a kind of arena for the absolutely contemporary, for the new. As I tried to say when I was talking about the history of this place, it really was established as a museum. It is what it should be. It should be a place that takes a step back, that assesses, that does things that can't be done elsewhere. It is not, nor has it been in its history, something that was a contemporary gallery, just a show. And when I mentioned the number of works we've shown in this projects thing, for example, we've shown as many works, not as many, but about half as many works in those 4 years as were shown in the several American artist shows that were over a 21-year span. So just, in other words, that it's a false question in that sense, and I just want to make that clear because you...
Well, I don't think it's a false question, but what I wish you would do would be to clarify some of what you refer to as being, mythic attitudes on the part of the public.
Well, let me go back to the original one, just to explain in essence what we're talking about. I had the space, we had the space and the financial problem. We have been trying to find a solution to those problems for some years. At one point we were seriously exploring the possibility that, because the museum has one unrealized asset, which is a very valuable one considering its location right here in the center of the city, which are the air rights which it owns here, which would obviously vary in value from depending on economic times. But we've always recognized that these were in some way an asset, a hidden asset of the museum that we could realize. In past years, in different times, there were very serious studies done about the possibility of building an office building using those air rights.
Or of moving the museum itself.
Or moving the museum itself. There were discussions, the possibility of selling this land.
And not out of New York, I mean,
not
this
out
time.
of New York, but there were, all of these have been explored, so it's not really a new idea at all. The business buildings had disadvantages. There were questions of building the museum as part of the first few floors. Just to take an obvious one, forgetting even the economic situation, take the fact of how many banks of elevators you need for an office building that you don't need for an apartment building, so that it takes a lot of space away from galleries. All of these things we went through. Trying again to find the solution, we calculated that there was no way, really, in which, without something innovative, we could possibly realize, strengthen our endowment, and also build an expansion in tough times for money, the kind of monies we could raise. We simply couldn't raise $40, $50 million. So the proposal was developed with great care that this might be a device under which we could do this, and the essence of it is very simple. We are proposing now to we've gotten the legislation through to establish a trust for cultural resources, which is empowered to deal with a developer, which insulates the museum so our collection is not at risk, to develop those air rights in the form of what seems at the present time, when the office space is not much in demand, to be the better alternative, namely a condominium apartment tower, which would be over the buildings which the museum owns to the west here, which are not part of the museum now. I mean, they're part of the museum,
office
but
buildings now.
they're office buildings and our bookstore and so forth. The trust would also be empowered to receive two things: to turn over to the museum a portion of the profits from that development in order to strengthen the museum's endowment. It would also be empowered through the legislation to give the museum the equivalency of the tax payments that would otherwise be due to the city from such a development. And this is really quite complex, but that's the...
And a very innovative fundraising scheme by anybody's standards.
And it is innovative, but it's also something that other institutions have found extremely interesting and that could be adapted to other institutions. And the whole tax equivalency thing is another way to look at that. Is not simply as something that appears to be a gimmick, and I don't want to take the time to go into all of this. But remember that some of the greatest institutions in this city are supported by city support with all the problems we're in.
This
museum gets
no
not 1 cent from the
support.
city except for $13,000 toward a public high school program, which we believe by any rational calculation costs us about $60,000 or $70,000.
You might talk to the point of the ad hoc nature of city support and how it evolved with other museums and why you don't get any.
Well, you would go on with one or go into that?
No, continue with the main thought.
No, but just to finish the project thing, this is a device, in other words, by which we believe that we can, it's really a different way of the city assisting this institution is what it comes down to. But it's also a way in which we're helping ourselves to accomplish this. And we have to raise a total of $27 million ourselves to bring this about, so it's not that easy. And all of it has to come together, and we're gambling then on higher attendance, being able to serve the public better, on expanded bookstore, other income-producing things. All of these things, plus maintaining our annual fund, have to come together if this project is to work. So, then to move the one step further, it is at the present time about the only way we would see, except to sell the place and establish ourselves somewhere else, or hand the collection away. If you have a responsibility for keeping this institution as it is, this seemed to be the best way of doing it. And Pacha, your friend who spoke at that meeting, we have done all kinds of studies about the garden. We are more concerned, I assure you, than anybody from the outside about preserving that space and not having it in the shade.
Well, equally concerned as some others, I'm sure.
Very concerned. In fact, our shadow calculations, just to belabor the point, indicate that by taking some of the garbage that we now have for the heating system and so on off the top of this building, which is one of the major things that shadows the garden is the building itself, we will probably improve the shading of the garden. Okay.
I don't think that's belaboring the point. I think it's clarifying it, Dick, and I wish that you would interpret the questions in that fashion, too. I realize that 3 of your board members are 3 of the most distinguished architects in the world, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Barnes, and Mr. Bunshaft, let alone the other board members, and I assume it is neither without haste or without a calculated risk that you've entered into this enterprise. Who will the architect be, since I assume those 3 gentlemen are excluded from designing the building?
Yes, we had to make the difficult decision, which actually was incorporated in the legislation in terms of potential conflict of interest, that none of the architects on our board could be selected for the project, which made life rather rough since we'd selected what we thought were among the best of them around.
And not only the most distinguished architects, those who were known for their museum design as well.
Exactly. And that was,
there are
of course, one of the
left.
reasons why they were here. There are a few. But
have you made any choices yet?
We have, drawing on the advice of the architects on our board as an advisory committee, they have recommended a small group of architects whom we are in the process of interviewing.
I think those names have been mentioned publicly.
I can't really myself. I know there's been a lot of talk and speculation in the press and so on. It would be really out of order for me to mention them if you don't mind. But I hope that we'll make that decision in the next 30 to 60 days.
Is the plan to give the museum a 50th birthday present? Will the wing be open by then? The building?
Well, that's what we'd hoped originally, but things have moved more slowly than we planned. Maybe we'll have a 50th anniversary groundbreaking. I don't know which. we're going to try to keep in operation as much as we can, because of course the construction will be to the west of the building. I hasten to say there are problems to be solved on this, still to be resolved, and it is not by the men with picks and shovels are not waiting at our door today, I assure you. So.
And bearing in mind the purpose of the museum, no matter what keeps it alive, and that is its responsibility to educate, to conserve, to preserve, to enlighten. What are some of the future shows you have planned? Do you have planned for your 50th anniversary? I assume that's in the works too.
Well, one of the things that's complicated our planning, obviously, is this whole building development, because I cannot really project where I will be in 1979, whether we will be advanced in the building or whether we will be carrying on much as we have. We have scheduled our shows through totally through 1977. We are working on a schedule which will be precised very shortly for 1978. 79, which is indeed our anniversary year, I haven't really been able to set. One of the things that we, of course, have talked about doing was to, ideally, if one opened with the new space, you'd open most logically with the whole panoply of the larger display of the collection, which is what I'd like best to do. I can't really predict what the exhibition will be. We've even talked in terms of assisting the campaign that we're going to have and of making our problems clear to people, of having specifically during that period various shows from our various collections to show not only the wealth of the collections but also the space problems that we have. Upcoming shows now, just to reel through them quickly, we have the next show after the Natural Paradise. I'm speaking, of course, only of the garden wing shows, because we actually have between 30 and 40 shows in any given year here in the various other spaces. Speaking only of those major garden wing shows, we have a show of masterpieces from Swiss collections, which are less well known to travelers because we don't always go to those museums, but are absolutely sensational works. And we will, when that show goes up, we will have under this roof, between our own collection and the works we are borrowing from Basel and Bern and some of the other great collections, probably the greatest display of Cubist works that's ever been under one roof at any given time.
What are two or three?
Beyond that, the Rauschenberg
in March,
the Harry Callahan photography show, a show based on Vollard, works he commissioned and collected. Can't even think of then a big late Cézanne show beyond that, which would be a really massive show.
What are two or three of the most outstanding collections of modern art in the world?
It's really a very tough question to answer, because some are enormously rich in certain areas, others are very rich across the board. Some are rich because they have just particular masterpieces. I don't really know what I could answer. It's in a way one of the things that points up what's special about this place is that when, again, going back to that question you were talking about disposing of some works in order to provide funds for more recent ones, the thing I keep emphasizing is that the way in which this collection has been built and is displayed is a very large part of its importance, because you don't just cut off the back end or leave out some pieces, because this is the only museum in the world, and that includes any of the ones that I would mention as having great collections. It's the only one where you can really get not only the full phasing of the movement, but you can also get at the same time, concurrently, photography, architecture, all the others that are fitting into one space. So that, I mean, when you think of something like Beaubourg, the museum that's the new museum in Paris, obviously there are great paintings in the Musée de l'Art Moderne that are going to be transferred to that. They are really not as great as this collection. If their donors will let them do it.
You mentioned earlier that there were some gaps in this collection. If you were to find a donor who would supply them, what is it that you need?
Well, there are some that fall in the historical category. For example, the collection is not as rich as my curators would like it to be in the area, oddly enough, since we had the great show of it, which was not completely without some thought of potential gifts, is in the field of Fauvism, to some extent in German Expressionism. There are some of those historical movements in which we are not that rich. At the same time, we have elements like Futurism, where we have the greatest collection of any museum here or in Italy or anywhere, so that it's a balance out. Obviously, our Picasso holdings are enormous. so that you can identify these gaps. I mentioned the Munch. There are certain areas where we would like to build more deeply. And one of them, I would say the most serious problem for this museum, in my own view, and I really hesitate to speak for the curatorial departments, is precisely the area we were talking about earlier, namely the more recent work by some of the better known artists. The prices are so high in terms of the acquisition funds that we have available. It is a great problem. There are very few artists whom we would, or I should say few well-known artists, few if any, who are not represented in this museum, but to be represented simply by one work is unfair to that artist, is unsatisfactory to this museum. We don't have the depth to lend to other collections or to lend to shows. And this is true in a lot of instances. We're very rich in paintings in the abstract expressionists. We are less rich in several of the pop artists, in a number of others I could mention. So that this is a continuing thing. And one of the things that was a problem here was the change in the tax laws, because some of the
certainly a disadvantage to museums of modern art. Some of the artists
were very generous to this museum.
Would you explain the disadvantage to artists versus collectors, for example, and how it has affected your collections?
Well, in really the simplest terms, the Tax Reform Act changed the system by which an artist had the same privilege that a collector did, namely to donate a work at fair market value to a non-profit institution. They limited it then to simply being able to donate the cost of the materials, in other words, the paint, the canvas, the brush. This, of course, just was an absurdity, and we have been trying to change it. In the most recent Tax Act, Senator Javits had worked very hard to get the law changed, at least in part. It wasn't a full deduction, but it certainly would have been a great improvement. It was knocked out at the last minute, and we're continuing to fight for that. The effect has been that many artists who did indeed generously help us with works, even over a prolonged basis, have really not had the advantage of doing that, and it's unfair to expect they would. So if there's no misunderstanding, I don't
Have
want
your donations fallen off as a result?
Yes, they have, particularly in areas such as prints and so on. I really have to add, because I don't want to leave that a wrong impression, no museum really likes to build its collection by asking an artist to donate his work, and it's something that wherever possible you don't want to do, and you avoid it. And certainly we very rarely will accept a work from an artist when it's the first work in the collection, because we feel the museum should at least have that sign of commitment that it should purchase a work from the artist. The kind of thing I'm talking about is more an instance when you have a well-established artist who has reserved certain works for himself, has no problem selling the others, but feels that some work have been very important in his own development. He's held on to those. He doesn't really want them to go into a private collection, and he would like that really to be in a museum. And that's the kind of work I'm thinking of, and that's what
well, you more than most are sympathetic to the problems of the creative artist himself, not only because of your role here, but the familial connection. I've often wondered, what were those Oldenburgs fed to have two such important forces on contemporary art? Was there anything in your background that would have revealed the fact that both of you, from a diplomatic background, there seems to be quite a reach to the impact both of you have had on contemporary art?
Well, if you believe in genes or something, there were some painters floating around, and my mother was an opera singer and so on, but I don't really. As I've already explained, my own arrival in this field was something that I hadn't expected and certainly didn't plan. I did come here in publications. I was making a career in publishing. My brother, on the other hand, for whatever familial reasons or inheritance, was so deeply interested in art from as long as I can possibly remember. And he was someone who I think certainly interested me and was helping me to become more aware of this, and that was very important. The two of us had never planned really to cross lines, and we try to keep as separate as we possibly can.
Excuse me for one moment. I want to pursue that a bit longer. Please go on. You're talking about
I'm afraid I really finished off the tape.
Well, when you first came here, one of your friends teased and said that you were going to turn the museum into a soft sculpture. Obviously, that hasn't occurred. But I wonder if you'd tell us, excluding your brother, who your favorite artists are.
Boy, is that a question I never answer.
Every other museum director has.
No, I won't.
Are there any special favorites that you have?
I have quite a few, but...
Are there any particular paintings that you would cite among those that are your favorites? Or objects?
Oh, heavens, I mean, they're asking me what I like. I could name so many, but I mean, that becomes a question of personal taste.
Would you name some of them?
What else? I like Johns, I like Rauschenberg, I like my brother, I like Clifford Still, I like the Matisse Room. Going all through this, I think that it's... the thing you've got to remember is that my own position at this place, because of my background, is one where, for my own position vis-a-vis this structure, it's very important that I'm really the director of this museum as really the administrative director, because I really rarely talk out, or I try to avoid talking out on the curatorial issues, because in each of those areas I feel that those people are more qualified than I and should properly be speaking for the museum.
In the future, do you think that a museum director should be an administrator or an art historian?
I think you can even be both, but it depends obviously much on the circumstance, the size of an institution. I think that this institution is big enough, the same has happened with the Art Institute in Chicago or other examples you can mention, where what used to be a job that I think the trustees expected too much. They thought they could get, usually a very low salary, a director who was a curator, who was a fundraiser, who was an administrator, who was all of these things at once. What happens, quite aside from finding a person who combines all those qualities, you simply don't have time. It's a complicated world now, and far more complicated for museums than it ever was. You are asked to do more, you have union questions, you've got financial problems, you've got an endless development in legalities to be watched over and problems with insurance, all of these things. I think museums are more and more being forced to a situation where they have to demand that whoever is trying to run the place have some skill in those areas as well as in the curatorial areas. Sometimes you do it by supplementing a curator, sometimes you do it by finding the combination in the same place. I think it's a shame when you take a person who is absolutely top flight in his field, whether it's Greek pots or modern art, and turn that person into simply an administrator. I think it's a very poor use of intelligent resources. So I don't think it's necessarily bad when a museum decides that they can go with an administrative person as long as that person is reasonably sensitive to exactly what his curators are about. I don't think there's a real answer to that question. I think it's a trend that's developing because of the problems, but ultimately the strength of the museum obviously depends on its curatorial staff and its collection.
Modest reply. One last question. We've just had an election, and it's on everyone's mind. What President-elect Carter is going to do, in all respects, is obviously a topic of lively speculation. What is your view of what a Democratic Carter administration will do for the arts?
Well, I can only go by a recent statement that was made, at least in President-elect's name, which I received from Congressman Bradamus, which I must say was a very encouraging statement. It reiterated all its strong support for the national endowments. It picked up and, in fact, reinforced the support for a program that President Ford had just announced that he was going to introduce in January, because, as remind all of you, the outgoing president still presents the budget in January, and so that he had announced that he was going to ask for supplemental appropriation for challenge grants for arts institutions. Carter has gone on record saying that he supports that completely. If there was one thing that was perhaps a little special in Carter's statement that interested me, because I don't know what the full meaning is. In other words, I have every reason to believe from what I've seen printed that his views will be supportive of the arts and of the established arts institutions. There's one thing in the statement that could be of special interest. There's a specific reference to the support given by the New Deal to artists themselves, to the direct support of the artists. And he links it with the unemployment problem, which of course has been his major point throughout the election. at this point, anyone is sort of reading tea leaves, but it's an interesting suggestion that there may be, in Carter's view, a stronger need and a stronger impulse for direct aid to the artist through projects, whether it's on the order of WPA or whether it's something else.
CEDA.
One can't, or CEDA, one can't really predict, but certainly that strain seems to be in the statement. And I think there's much that can be done there, provided it's done intelligently, and that's, of course, always the question when you're dealing with government support of the arts. So far, I think we've been quite lucky through the endowments, and I would hope that the same kind of program. Mondale himself was very much involved in sponsoring a portion of this new legislation which provides for direct assistance on projects to photographers and to filmmakers. And that's in the appropriation, it's in the authorization, which of course funds yet have to be appropriated.
And of course, Mrs. Mondale was a museum docent and is a national board member of the Associated Councils of the Arts. Under any circumstances, we look forward to that and to your new program with a high sense of adventure and interest. Thank you very much, Richard Oldenburg, Director of the Museum of Modern Art. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and thank you for being with us. Now what we do is have the class share in the interviewing process, and if you have a question, if you would please raise your hand, I will call on you. Larry.
Certainly this museum does a great deal for the community, and I think all
I'll repeat
museums
the
do.
question.
I wonder if there's a precedent for cities sharing essentially its tax revenues with the museum. As I think about the question, I can think of the recent construction of the Museum in New Haven, which Mr. Mellon helped Yale to do through British Studies, and they're just the opposite of great.
If I may repeat the question so that we can record it, and correct me if I am wrong. You're saying that this museum has a community involvement, a community relationship. Is there a way to share that tax revenue?
Yeah, what happened in New Haven is that Mr. Mellon helped Yale build a British Studies Center, and Yale has agreed to pay New Haven taxes on the portion of that which is used for commercial purposes.
Well, maybe you should clarify the potential tax relationship to the city that this
Well,
building...
in other words, obviously, the major pattern of city support, this city support, has been direct allocation of funds to museums and some other institutions for guards, for operations, maintenance, and so on. There have been other parallels to the plan that we're dealing with. For example, there's a complicated device by which city center is assisted indirectly by the city, and there are other patterns in other communities. I'm not sure whether I understood whether you were talking about the aspect of tax revenues by a nonprofit, from a nonprofit institution. You were mentioning...
If you were to build an entity, a physical entity, which could produce revenue, such as the stores in New Haven can produce in that building, you would hope that the city would share with you, give you, essentially, the revenue which would ordinarily be paid as tax.
But this building has a mixed-use development.
It has a
It's
mixed use. I won't go into the complexities now, but some of the stuff that you're talking about in New Haven is in this bill. As an example, any property that the museum takes off the tax rolls beside what the museum now has, the museum will continue to pay taxes on to the city. Above a certain level of the tax equivalency payments, the tax revenues will be shared equally between this museum and the city. So in other words, a lot of those devices have been incorporated, and it was one of the things that was important in getting the legislation through, was that it was really a shared effort to try to bring this about, and I think that is on the pattern that you're talking about, the tax.
Are there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What areas involved in the museum are open to potential volunteers?
What areas of involvement in the museum are open to the potential volunteer?
There are several areas, but we've got some special problems with volunteers in this museum, because the most common thing among museums throughout the country are that you have docents, you have people helping with classes and so forth. There again, we get back to the space problem, because crowded as the galleries will be, the thing that makes them really intolerable is when you have groups going through with lecturers and all of the noise simply that comes on this. We have only, for that reason, we have one person on staff who's taking regular tours, and then we have special hours for people who take group visits and so on, so that we can schedule them. That eliminates a large part of what volunteer organizations frequently do for museums. Because of that, what we have been forced to do on a volunteer basis, in the few instances where we have volunteers working, we have tried to because there's also a problem in the staff itself having time to train people and to supervise them. So that what we've tried to do is to find volunteers whom we are really asking to be on the same level as our own staff in terms of background training, so that if we can't afford to have that job filled, that there's someone who's really willing to help us catalog a project or to work on a specific project that needs to be done, rather than simply come in and assist. We have several people within the museum doing that. It does make it difficult because it sometimes makes it look as though the museum didn't appreciate an offer for someone who will simply be willing to do almost anything. On a few occasions, when I find that someone really is willing to do almost anything, like file or help us with some of the other things, we've been grateful for that help too. I also have to add that we've got 5 unions at this place who don't think that volunteers are necessarily the answer to all the problems in the museum.
It's a question from a former museum director.
Not a director of education. You started to talk about the International Council, and I understand they are volunteers. You never did complete, and I'm very interested in hearing some more about the International Council.
Well, the International Council goes back historically to the 50s. What happened was that it was recognized that after the war, and this was particularly oriented toward Europe, but then it broadened out across the world, it was recognized that particularly after the war, there had been so long a period when no one was aware of really what was going on in other countries, and particularly no one was understandably aware of what had been going on in the United States art scene by people in Europe. So that with special funding, we set up something called the International Program, which started organizing shows and in fact subsidizing shows to be sent abroad. And over the years they've been sent to every continent, and we've continued that program. The International Council, can't really say volunteers, because the International Council was set up as a group of people from countries abroad, but also throughout this country, who might be basically attached or supportive of their own museums and their own communities, and not necessarily involved with this museum, but who did believe in the whole idea of international exchange and wanted to support that program. And so they set up this organization that pays dues. And
membership organization.
It's really a membership organization.
Perhaps the confusion is it is run by a professional volunteer.
Exactly. It's run by a professional group, in other words, by really an administrative staff here at the museum, drawing on our own curators. The International Council is basically a support group, although an extremely interested and knowledgeable one, because they're, for the most part, people who are very much involved in their own museum areas. But it's not really a volunteer group in that sense.
Well, in the sense that most volunteers want to become support groups, not necessarily do things like docenting, although that they do that because they feel they're supporting the museum. And I was interested in the International Council because they are, in effect, they volunteer their time, they pay for their own travel, I assume, and things like that. But they see themselves not as volunteers, but supporters. And that may be an approach in museums, instead of calling people volunteers, that they can be thought of, how can we support the museum? How can we do more for it?
Well, I mean, by that analogy, if that's what you were getting at, in that sense, all of my members are volunteers and contributing members, and all of the people who do it. And it's not simply by the memberships and by giving money directly. It's also an enormous number of people who help us by actively fundraising for the museum or developing programs. And we talked about the Junior Council, where we've had these events for students, or we've had programs in prisons. We've had all of these things, which are being manned by auxiliary activities here.
Would it be accurate?
Don't for a moment think that when I'm saying a volunteer,
Yes.
I'm not thinking that. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, our annual fund is the product of volunteers, and this museum couldn't survive without that. I was simply addressing myself maybe too narrowly to what frequently is the case when people write saying that I would love to work here.
The volunteers think of being put down for that reason, but they really want to be supporters rather than
Sure, no,
take over a
I certainly didn't mean to suggest that at all. I think that, there is this museum as much as any other. There are very few private museums in this country that could really survive without that broad definition of volunteers. That's what it's all about. And that's the only reason we do survive versus the publicly supported institutions in other countries.
Another question, yes, sir.
What is the space of the Whitney Museum next door being used for? Is there any likelihood that that'll be used again as gallery space?
The question was, what is the space of the Whitney Museum next door being used for, and is there the possibility that it be used as gallery space?
There's certainly the possibility in a whole reconstruction. At the present time, most of the Whitney was necessarily...
Can you identify the space that he's referring to, please?
The former Whitney building, when the Whitney moved uptown, is the building that's at the far end of the garden, at the west end of the garden. And when the last reconstruction in '64...
on 54th Street.
On 54th Street, and that's where the old entrance was. When that last reconstruction took place, it was more efficient to use that space because of its problem of connecting it for support facilities. That's where our conservation department is, it's where our library is. It's in part used for gallery space, but a large portion of it is really for equally important support areas. If the plan goes through for the reconstruction, the larger gallery space, and this would permit slightly more than twice the amount of gallery space we have now, the bulk of that gallery space would be in a new building, because that would be the logical axis for, anyone who comes to this museum knows that one of our ghastly problems is trying to get up to the other floors. If you waited for those elevators, you'd go mad. And so that I would hope that we would have a better system of circulation, hopefully with escalators that would go up in that area. So in that sense, probably the Whitney space as such would be incorporated as gallery space.
One last question.
Talk about space. How much thought have you given to, say, taking part of your activities out of here, like Ratchet movies, and taking space in the New York Cultural Center, just a big empty now?
The question was, how much thought have you given to taking some of your activities out of this museum and putting them in other existing facilities, such as the New York Cultural Center, which is not only underutilized, it is empty at the moment?
Well, the two-part answer. The first one is that we have, on occasion, considered that. We've really thought about how we might, whether there is an area that might logically be moved, and in fact we have some of our operations in these buildings that people don't think of as part of the museum to the west here that we own. The real answer to your question, however, is that when you look at something like the Cultural Center, is that unfortunately that building is empty, but it has to be heated, lit, tended, guarded, and all of that, and those costs are really prohibitive. If I were, I would be, other than the obvious disadvantage of having territorial areas outside of a central location, there's nothing in theory wrong with that as an advantage if one had space that was fully covered, secured, climate controlled for free, is what you would really need. Otherwise, you just wind up in a situation where you make the financial situation of the museum more difficult rather than better. That's been the problem with the various suggestions that have been made over the years, that there should be a downtown branch, or that there is, should be all kinds of other gallery areas. It's not at all a foolish suggestion. It's one that the realities have never really come together to make it possible.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, would you please, of me, I think we've burdened Mr. Oldenburg enough for this evening. Please wait, I'd be glad to reply. See you next week, the new school.
Could I just mention something?
Please, there are some envelopes in the back, by the way.
There are some envelopes back there which I won't be hurt if many of you don't pick up, because I want to tell you exactly what they are. I'm sure that some of you are very familiar with this museum, some of you I'm sure aren't. What are in these folders are simply some information on the basic layout of the museum, the information and plan, the membership, a book list, just some standard background information on the museum. You're very welcome to take it. They're in those envelopes there. Whatever your knowledge of this place, I hope we'll see you here under other circumstances as well. The museum, as you know, is open.
You're tethered.
Pardon?
Thank you, by the way, for your invitation to us to come to the museum.
That's what I assume that you realize that the museum is open till 9 tonight. You're very welcome to see the show on the first floor, or for that matter, the permanent collection galleries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What am I doing?